Mr. President, there was a significant talk at the summit about climate change. I know in the past you've harbored some skepticism of a science and climate change. What do you think the world should be doing about climate change, and do you still harbor that skepticism?
I feel that the United States has tremendous wealth. The wealth is under its feet. I've made that wealth come alive. We will soon be exporting. In fact, we're actually doing it now, exporting. But we are now the #1 energy producer in the world, and soon it will be by far, with a couple of pipelines that have not been able to get approved for many, many years. It'll have a huge impact. I was able to get ANWR in Alaska, could be the largest site in the world for oil and gas. I was able to get ANWR approved. Ronald Reagan wasn't able to do it. Nobody was able to do it. They've been trying to do it since before Ronald Reagan. I got it approved. We're the #1 energy producer in the world. Soon it will be by far the #1. It's tremendous wealth, and LNG is being sought after all over Europe and all over the world, and we have more of it than anybody else. And I'm not going to lose that wealth. I'm not going to lose it on dreams, on windmills, which, frankly, aren't working too well. I'm not going to lose it. So
the Trump administration has been, objectively speaking, bad for U.S. climate policy. But it's probably been less bad than you think. Now, the Trump administration has certainly changed the United States' stance vis-a-vis climate policy, to say nothing of its broader reorientation of U.S. public policy. The most obvious example is the U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, a global agreement that established a voluntary set of country-specific emissions targets to try and keep global temperature rise by the end of this century well below 2 degrees Celsius, and to pursue efforts to limit that temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. He's also expressed some rather, let's call them unorthodox views on the potential negative health consequences of alternative energy.
If you have a windmill anywhere near your house, congratulations. Your house just went down 75% in value. And they say the noise causes cancer. You told me that one, okay?
This point is especially odd in light of the fact that coal-fired power plants prematurely kill 23,300 Americans every year. President Trump appointed Andrew Wheeler, a former coal industry lobbyist and chief counsel for climate denier James Inhofe. You'll remember him as the senator who brought a snowball into the chamber as proof positive global warming wasn't occurring, to head up the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a little like appointing a fox to guard a henhouse. His administration has rolled back fuel economy targets for motor vehicles from 5% efficiency gains per year to 1.5% per year, and effectively banned U.S. states, like California, from imposing their own more stringent rules. It's also rolled back rules governing things like airborne mercury emissions and coal ash storage, in order to make the U.S. coal industry more cost competitive with other forms of energy. Despite this, coal usage in power generation is still down 22% from 2016, before he had taken office. Just as subsidizing hay would not have stopped the transition from horse and buggy to automobile, deregulating coal is unlikely to cause that industry to really rebound. The better mousetrap has been invented. And these changes carry over into the climate security realm as well. The 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review, which is the top-level unclassified document outlining U.S. military priorities and concerns, it's sort of like the Global Threat Assessment's bigger, more boring sibling, mentioned climate change 8 times in 64 pages, both addressing the types of missions the U.S. military would undertake and the threats to its physical infrastructure. The QDR was replaced under the Trump administration with the National Defense Strategy document, which mentions it 0 times in only 11 pages. You've already seen that it fell out of the top 8 threats as identified by the intelligence agencies, yet it's still hanging on to a position in the top 10. And the Trump administration has tried to block intelligence officials from talking about the threat. Rod Schoonover, a senior State Department intelligence official who had been the senior analyst on climate and environmental security-related issues, resigned in protest after his testimony to Congress was blocked by the Trump administration from being entered into the official record. However, the pace and scale of all these changes are, all things considered, pretty minor when compared to the fiery rhetoric you've been hearing. This is for 2 principal reasons. The first is that civil society, and more importantly, big business, with a few notable exceptions of course, have gotten religion on the reality of climate change and realized there's a buck to be made in being part of the energy transition and decarbonizing the economy. The second is that the U.S. federal government moves pretty slowly. Continuity is the general rule, rather than change. We don't tend to see massive swings in public policy. though some of the ones we have seen are frankly horrifying. The U.S. political system and the nature of bureaucratic institutions mean the U.S. government, and thus policy changes, is much more like a freight train than it is a sports car. It takes a while to get going in a particular direction, but it typically takes as long or even longer to stop. You don't really have to take my word for it either. President Trump has a pretty imperial view of the presidency, to be sure, but his actual power over U.S. policy was dwarfed by that of President Harry Truman, who inherited an economy and federal government fully mobilized during the Second World War. The two War Powers Acts of 1941 and 1942 gave the president the unilateral power to reorganize the executive branch, independent government agencies, and government corporations for the war cause, as well as censor mail. Now think about what that would look like in the present day. That would mean censorship of email and Twitter and social media more generally. And it would give the president the right to declare private land federal land for military purposes. Heck, Truman is the only leader in the history of the world to ever unleash the fury and destructive power of nuclear weapons. This is the kind of power that Trump can really only dream of. Still, Truman often found himself running up against the constraints of the U.S. presidency. He famously said, "I sit here all day trying to persuade people to do the things they ought to have the sense to do without my persuading them. That's all the powers of the president amount to." Now, either he was even more megalomaniacal and power-hungry than the presidents who would come after, and given that he went to night school and was born in Lamar, Missouri, that's probably not the case, or the person of the U.S. president is less powerful in policy-making than you might think. Outside of these one-off periods of incredibly rapid change, like World War II, most of the way the government does business changes relatively little from administration to administration, and the U.S. national security community has no time or patience for climate denial. In recent lectures, we've talked about institutions as a set of formal and informal rules that organize and routinize social, political, and economic relations between actors, like individuals or governments. Today, we'll add another usage into the mix and talk about literal institutions, which are permanent or semi-permanent organizations like the U.S. Congress, the Department of Defense, and the Navy, the institutions that make laws and then implement them. Let's talk first about the nature of the U.S. political system. The U.S. political system is, by design, one created to forestall rapid changes in policy, absent near universal consensus. From the separation of powers to judicial review to federalism, there are all sorts of institutional breaks on the policymaking process that require multiple branches of government to implement. Separation of powers makes change hard. Bicameralism, or having two legislative bodies with different compositions that must agree to policy changes, makes that harder still. And having judicial review means the constitutionality of laws and actions of government can be challenged in court. Finally, the federal system means that the states retain responsibility over all sorts of regulatory actions, and the states, as you well know, are a pretty diverse group. This isn't the United Kingdom, with its effectively unicameral governing body — keep in mind the House of Lords is really a tea party with a fancy title — and unitary form of government. When you see change in partisan control of the UK government, you see real policy change, and fast. Not so much in the United States. The second reason relates to the bureaucracy, or what President Trump often, and not accidentally, refers to as the deep state, those government officials who carry out the day-to-day tasks of actually implementing and enforcing government policy.
Today we're going to talk about bureaucracies just as soon as I finish filling out these forms. Do I really have to initial here, here, and here on all three copies, Stan? Regulations say so? All right. I'm just kidding. I don't really have to fill out forms in triplicate in order to make an episode of Crash Course. But this kind of stuff is one of the main reasons that people don't like bureaucracies. Americans tend to associate them with incomprehensible rules and time-wasting procedures, and probably most annoying, actual bureaucrats. But bureaucracies are a lot like our extended families in that we largely don't understand, or at least don't appreciate, the important role that bureaucracies play in our lives, mainly because of all the forms, and because my cousin who always ate all the cookies from the jar at Grandma's house. So what exactly is a bureaucracy? I don't like to do this because I'm arrogant and lazy, but sometimes it's helpful to go to a dictionary when you need to find out what a word means. So here's a serviceable political science-y definition. A bureaucracy is a complex structure of offices, tasks, rules, and principles of organization that are employed by all large-scale institutions to coordinate the work of their personnel. 2 points to emphasize here. First, bureaucracies are made up of experts who usually know more about the topic at hand than you do, and who are able to divide up complex tasks so that they can get done. Second, all large-scale institutions use bureaucracies bureaucracies, so the distinction between big business and big government is, in at least this respect, bogus, or what I like to call a false dichotomy. Is that too pretentious to say false dichotomy, Stan? I don't care. I'm saying it. False dichotomy. So if people hate bureaucracies so much and compare them unfavorably with Google and Amazon, why do we have them? Well, the main reason is that bureaucracies are efficient. They make it easier for government to accomplish tasks quickly and to basically operate at all. In the US, federal bureaucrats fulfill a number of specific important functions. One, bureaucrats implement the laws that Congress writes. Have you ever read a law? They're pretty complicated. It's a good idea to have experts who can interpret them and put them into action. Two, bureaucrats also make and enforce their own rules. But this isn't as action heroish as it sounds. And three, they settle disputes through a process called administrative adjudication, which makes them kind of like courts. Now, since I know that all of you have been paying extremely close attention to these episodes, you know that at least two of those functions are problematic in ways that go beyond making rules that seem Byzantine or stupid, or both. Byzantupid. The big concern here is the separation of powers, which you remember is the idea that power is divided between three branches of government. Technically, the federal bureaucracy is part of the executive branch, but it's so big that it dwarfs the other two branches and can easily overpower them. Much like I overpower this eagle. That's right, eagle. I make my own rules, like a bureaucracy. But an even more troubling, to some people, aspect of bureaucracies is what they actually do. So let's go to the thought bubble. Bureaucracies don't just enforce the rules, they make new ones, called regulations. In doing this, they are acting like a legislature, especially since the rules have the force of law and people can be punished for breaking them. For example, if you say sticks on TV, the FCC can fine you, just like the local law enforcement would if you broke a state law against speeding. And don't say sticks to the cop. But according to the Constitution, Congress is supposed to make the laws, so if you're a constitutional formalist, this is going to give you fits. On the other hand, the rulemaking process allows for a degree of popular participation that goes way beyond what happens in Congress. In 2014, Congress called for the mandatory notice and comment period on new FCC rules on the issue of net neutrality. Any person can read the proposed rules, which are not easy to understand, and offer a public comment, including suggestions for new rules using the internet. The bureaucracy is required to read the comments, and they can be incorporated into the final rules that are published in the Federal Register. So in a way, federal rulemaking is more democratic than congressional lawmaking, but it's still not in the Constitution. Administrative adjudication raises similar separation of powers issues, but they're less problematic because the Constitution gives Congress the right to establish courts other than the Supreme Court, and it doesn't say that these can't be administrative tribunals that are part of bureaucratic agencies. Many low-level bureaucratic positions are filled through competitive exam-based civil service procedures, which are supposed to ensure a level of expertise and take politics out of the staffing process. But many upper-level bureaucratic leaders, especially cabinet secretaries and also ambassadors, are very political. For one thing, they're appointed by politicians who may be repaying favors or trying to pack the agencies with like-minded favorites. For another, bureaucrats engage in bargaining and protect their own interests, the very thing that politicians do all the time. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So, the first reason we keep bureaucracies is because bureaucracies are useful. They do get things done, even though it might not be as quickly as we'd like. And some of these things are things we want done, like inspecting our meat so we don't get E. coli or salmonella or mad cow disease. One response to this that we'll talk about later is to get rid of public bureaucracies and contract their tasks out to private companies. There's something to be said for this. After all, in a lot of ways, UPS does a better job of getting packages to us than the Postal Service does. And I also have a lot more fun at the private bowling alley than the public one. There's no such thing as a public bowling alley. If there is, I'm going. It might be free. But the main argument for privatization seems to be cost, and that one might not always be true. It seems unlikely that a private corporation would spring up to inspect meat, and although we could rely on pricing to signal that our chicken wings are salmonella-free, I don't think it's a good idea. So in addition to being useful and filling roles that the private sector might not fill, one of the reasons we have so many bureaucracies is because Congress keeps making them and delegating power to them. If we didn't have bureaucracy, congressmen and their staff would be taking on all the oversight and enforcement of their own laws. In addition to creating its own separation of powers problem, this might be kind of chaotic considering that potentially the entire House of Representatives could be replaced every 2 years. One advantage of bureaucracies is a certain amount of stability and the built-up expertise that comes with it. Probably the main reason why we don't change bureaucracies, though, is that doing so is really difficult. Once Congress makes a bureaucracy, it's usually permanent for a number of practical and political reasons. We'll get into those reasons next time. So I'm going to wrap this up with a little bit of a reminder about federalism, based on a largely unwarranted assertion. I bet that if you ask most Americans to give an example of a bureaucracy, they will say the DMV. Most people will tell you a DMV horror story of the time they had to wait in line for 4 hours just to renew their license, and when they got to the counter, a clerk told them that they didn't have the right forms and they needed to post a money order and not a credit card or a check or even cash, and that anyway they had to go on break and I had to come back in 15 minutes and all I wanted was my license. The DMV! And I sympathize with this predicament, but I feel the need to remind anyone who has had this experience at the DMV that it's a state bureaucracy, not the federal bureaucracy. Most of the bureaucrats you meet in your daily life, teachers, policemen, tax assessors, are officials of your state government, not the federal government like bureaucrat Jimmy. which is pretty much what the framers intended. So it's a good idea to be thoughtful about which government we're going to transfer our anger towards and to rage against the correct machine. That's what federalism's all about. Thanks for watching.
While climate change has receded from being a top-line priority for the current administration, that's not to say it has fallen off the radar of the national defense community. The defense community is a series of vast bureaucracies that are slow to adopt new priorities, but also very, very slow to discard old ones. The vast majority of people in the military and intelligence agencies, and agencies like NOAA and the EPA, are career officials or bureaucrats with decades-long, or at least who anticipate decades-long, service to the United States government. There are 2.2 million U.S. federal employees, not including the military and intelligence agencies. And only 0.02% of those employees are political appointees. That means that the overwhelming majority of people who are working in government were here before the Trump administration and will likely be here after it. And their procedures are highly structured and routinized, as are procedures for changing the ways that they make decisions. And changes to those decision-making processes can and often are challenged in court. And the national security bureaucracies are believers in climate change and very cognizant of its risks. Beginning in the 1990s but accelerating between the year 2000 and 2016, the U.S. national security community has gotten religion on the magnitude of the threat and the need for preparedness, and has been acting accordingly.
Climate change is real. We've got to address it rather than argue about what we're basing it on. We probably have more data on oceans and on weather patterns and things like that than any other organization. Inside the Navy, this really is the new normal. You don't have to convince anybody anymore. It's become part of the culture. As in everything in the Navy, you've got to keep one eye on the present, but you really do have to keep an eye a long time in the future. As climate change accelerates, storms are getting more intense and more frequent. The Navy got a request for humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, an average of every 2 weeks, somewhere in the world. The Navy and Marine Corps are America's first responders, and they're the world's first responders. And our sailors and Marines that are responding are seeing the effects today, not only in terms of how often they're called, but also in terms of when they get there, what the destruction is. You're seeing tides that would be abnormal, becoming normal. King tides are coming in. As sea levels rise, our bases are increasingly at risk, particularly Norfolk. It's far closer than people think. Unless sea level rise is mitigated, Norfolk will be at risk of disappearing as a base unless massive things are done to save it, and it will be done in the next few decades. They see the danger at least as much as we do. Having the base not be as effective, or not being able to put as many ships in, not being able to hire as many people, because it would devastate their economy. This is coming. This is happening. You got to start acting now. We're America's expeditionary force. Measuring salinity at the North Pole, said this was by far the thinnest he'd ever seen. As the Arctic becomes ice-free, you're going to have, number one, more commercial traffic. Number two, more friction, conflict over mineral extraction, this sort of thing. The U.S. Navy will be the one to enforce that. You have to say, what is the world going to look like? We not only look to adapt, but we were trying to do something to mitigate, to be better stewards of the environment by changing the types of fuel we used and by using less fuel. DoD uses more fossil fuels than any organization on Earth. We use 2% of all the oil and gas used in the United States. 2%. We were losing a Marine, killed or wounded, for every 50 convoys of fuel we brought to Afghanistan. That was too high a price to pay. In 2009, because I thought energy and power was a military vulnerability, I came out with some goals for Navy. That by no later than 2020, at least half of all energy afloat and ashore would come from non-fossil fuel sources. We've invested in 3 biofuel plants that are coming online this year. At the height of the fighting in Sangin, Marines went in and we gave them rollable solar panels to put in their packs to power their radios and their GPSs. They were making energy where they fought. And Navy has always been way in the forefront of new energy. It gives us a combat edge.
Even now, at what seems like the nadir for climate change's position as a national policy and security priority, there are active interagency working groups, task forces, and practical work being done to make the U.S. military more adaptable to changes in its operating environments and threats to its infrastructure.